They, like the subject and material, belong to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it. Something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life in which our world and our conceptions have no part. And yet, as the members severely shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man in that gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth. And whilst high up on the Greenland coast, had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimo, whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Eskimo knew little, and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying that it had come down from horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer, hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme devil or Tornasuk. And of this Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged Angekok, or wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Merman letters as best he knew how. But just now of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leaped high and over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, compromising a hideous picture of some cryptic writing. And so far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor as best to remember he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolist Eskimo. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details and a moment of really awed silence when both detective and scientists agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds of distance apart. What in substance both the Eskimo wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this, the word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in this phrase as chanted aloud. Fung Lui, Munglafal, Naf, Cthulhu, Rulue, Wagat, Nagel, Fatagan. Legrasse had pointed out in advance of Professor Webb for several among his men's mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants had told him the words meant. The text, as given, ran something like this. In his house at Roulier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. And now, in response to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legrasse related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attached profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of mythmaker and theosophist, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among half-castes and pariahs as might be least expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to the New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's men, were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known, and some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far within the black haunted woods, where no dweller ventured. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames. And, the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So, a body of 20 police filled 2 carriages and an automobile had set out in the late afternoon with a shivering squatter-esque guide. At the end of the Paso Road they alighted when 4 miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragment of a rotting wall, intensified by its hint of morbid habitation and depression from which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran up to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond the endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point-blank to advance another inch toward the scene of unholy worship, so Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided in black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before.